So good morning, everyone. So welcome again to the École Militaire. So if you are interested in the war in Ukraine and on the lessons learned about Ukraine, clearly this is the place to be. And I think you will adore this interview with Nick Reynolds. So just before I introduce Nick Reynolds, just a few words about myself. So I'm Major General Vincent Breton. I am head of a center located here in the École Militaire called CICDE, Centre interarmées de concepts, doctrines, expérimentation. That stands in English for Joint Centers for Concepts, Doctrines, and Experimentation. So we work on doctrine, but also on lessons learned, on operational foresight, and on wargaming. So I'm very pleased to interview this morning Nick Reynolds from the famous think tank RUSI. So RUSI and Nick's works on Ukraine are, I must confess, one of our major open source of information regarding the war on Ukraine and the lessons we draw from the war on Ukraine. And so, just on this slide, you see three outstanding papers published in recent years by RUSI and co-written by Nick over the past years and regarding the war in Ukraine. The last paper being the one on the right that was issued 1 month ago, and entitled "So Tactical Developments During the Third Year of the Russo-Ukrainian War." So Nick, you are at RUSI. You are the research fellow for land warfare, since you have an army background. Indeed, you served in the British Army, including in the hell of the Helmand campaign in Afghanistan in 2011-2012. So respect. And your research interests include land power, wargaming, and simulation. And prior to joining RUSI, you worked also for a private security company called Constellis. And so you hold a Bachelor of Arts in War Studies and a Master in Conflict, Security and Development from King's College London. And since 2022 and the beginning of a large-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, so you spent much of your time covering this war. And by the way, my first question is going to be, how many times have you been in Ukraine? And where do you go? Who do you visit when you go there?
Vincent, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And to the audience, it's a privilege to be addressing you all today. I know there's a lot of experience and expertise in the audience from across different European countries. So I'm hoping we can have a useful discussion for you guys today. Regarding Ukraine, how long we spent there? I think we were there every other month during 2022 and almost every other month in 2023. Now the tempo of visits has slightly decreased lately. I think as much as anything else, many other people have started to look at the war much more closely, started to be able to get into country and build access. So there wasn't quite the need for us to be there all the time. But certainly in the early days, I think a lot of people were heading west, and RUSI was heading east. I should also say that we were very, very privileged to have the amount of access that we did to the Ukrainian system. Much thanks to one of our associate fellows, Alexander V. Daniluk, who is my co-author, alongside Jack Watling on some of the reports, and also for the Ukrainian General Staff and some of their services, for basically trusting us and allowing us to interview them and allowing us to visit different units, different training establishments, and to really put what they're doing under the microscope in a way that they don't let a lot of other people do. In terms of where we visited, while a lot of the lessons learned were very much us going to Kiev and meeting people, we were also able to visit different units on the front line, predominantly in the Donbass. So we saw everything from some of the best Ukrainian units, such as 95th Air Assault Brigade, who are down in the Ukrainian New York, named after the more famous one, and right down to some territorial defense units that had been professionalized sufficiently to be plugged in alongside the regular army and pushed into Zaporizhzhia Oblast, as well as more recently we went up to Sumy to debrief some of the units that had been fighting up there, just north of the border in Kursk Oblast. I think I added up all the time that I spent in Ukraine, and it comes to just over 6 months. So 6 months in the last 3 years.
Right, thank you, Nick. So let's dive now in the heart of the topic, so on the lessons learned. I'm going to interview Nick for about 1 hour, and I will remain the remaining time for Q&A with the room. So in order to structure my interview, I'm going to take the chapter headings of the main lessons learned we have drawn in the CICDE regarding this war. And so I will ask Nick specific questions that will illustrate those main lessons. So according to us, according to CICDE, this war reveals 5 trends and highlights 5 major needs for French armed forces, but also for, I would say, for most of the Western countries. And so the first trend we consider is, we identify is a rapidly deterioration of the international security environment. So we see that we are confronted with a crisis of multilateralism, an open challenge to international order, the international order that has been established since the end of the World War II, by the way. And the result of that is clearly a disinhibition of violence, of brutality, almost everywhere over the planet, with many international actors preferring, I would say, power struggles in order to make their way. So even if there is a lot to say about this domain, I will not, about this first lesson, I will not ask Nick any question about that. I will directly jump on the second one, which is the multiplication of warfighting domains. The war in Ukraine is, I would say, take place in the 7 warfighting domains we used to consider, for example, in France. So those domains are land, sea, air, cyber, outer space, information, and electromagnetic warfare. And the war in Ukraine is, I would say, is a further proof of the extension of warfare to new domains, such as cyber, outer space, and information warfare. So we know that, talking about information warfare, that propaganda, information warfare are indeed as old as war is. So it's not really very new, but we see that it takes a new dimension with internet, with social networks, and so on. And so my first question to you, Nick, will be: what is the reality of information warfare on the battlefield, on the front line? Are there any informational attacks aimed directly at the Russian or at the Ukrainian soldiers directly on the front line? And if there is, what do they like, those attacks?
So I think currently, at this stage, because both sides are particularly aware of the issue of information warfare, the level of propaganda that both sides are utilizing domestically to maintain the will to fight, it's extensive, and I would say at the moment it's not particularly decisive. But thinking back to February 2022, I think that was perhaps the most important stage where information warfare, particularly of the kind, what kind of cognitive effects can you have either on the enemy or on the global publics or your own forces, that was perhaps the point which really tipped the balance. Now, looking back, it's easy for people to think that Ukraine fighting the way that it did was inevitable. Actually, my view is very much that the Russians came very close to achieving their aims. Their plan was not as bad as people sometimes make it out to be now. It had some critical flaws, but the Russian military and security services had answers to most of the problems that they thought they would face, and that they did face. It's there were some failures of synchronization, and in particular, they did not predict the Ukrainian information operations campaign at the beginning of the war. And I've seen it referred to as a few different things by the Russians. Nodal warfare is one of those that jumps to mind. They use a few other terms. The idea that if you seize particular key nodes, that enemy will to fight will collapse because they find that enemy forces having penetrated their lines, that they are surrounded, that there is a great deal of uncertainty. It's very classic maneuver warfare thinking that was behind the Russian, essentially demonstration of force. The interesting thing that happened, I found, was, and I remember when we were following the conflict in the first 3 days, it took about 3 days for my team to turn around to each other and say, this isn't really going very well. Everywhere we looked online, there were pictures of Ukrainian soldiers ambushing Russian armoured columns, of dead Russian soldiers, that Ukrainians were still fighting. And perhaps the most important thing there was that any Ukrainian soldier who was cut off from his unit, who was cut off from, or his unit was cut off from higher command and from direction, was, if they looked online to try and find out what was happening, and they went onto any of the accessible feeds, that was what they saw, the continued will to resist. As a Brit, I should say, this is something that we've experienced ourselves as well. If we look at World War II, Winston Churchill, we will fight them on the beaches. We often look back and see this as a very key aspect of our national character. The reality was, if you look at the social history of Britain at the time, it was a much more murky picture, with many people perhaps being less than willing to contribute or actively trying to avoid contributing to the war effort and putting themselves at risk, at personal risk. However, by setting expectations high, by showing that leadership, Churchill very much proactively shaped the expectations that the British population set for themselves. And I think the Zelensky administration and the Ukrainian services, at that critical point when they realized that the Russian invasion was real, which they did so very belatedly, the way that they leaned in and demonstrated that will to fight and that leadership, it set very high expectations, an example for others to follow. But that was not predetermined. And in fact, many of the Russian information operations, combined with some of their penetration of Ukrainian institutions, some of their agents of influence, particularly in the south of the country, we saw being very successful. I think we all remember how quickly Russian forces moved up through Kherson. Since then, at that moment where things were in a period of transition and people weren't so sure of what was happening, that proved very effective. Now, the volume of propaganda is such that, yes, it is having an influence, and what we are seeing is that volume in the information sphere really matters in terms of shaping people's perceptions. But at the same time, that ability to have decisive effect is not so easy.
Okay, thank you, Nick. So we see that this war is further proof of the extension of warfare to new domains, but we see also that the new war-fighting domains don't replace the traditional ones. That means land, maritime, air, and electromagnetic. And for us, for Europeans at least, we rediscover electromagnetic warfare. And so can you please describe the scale and intensity of electromagnetic warfare in Ukraine, and what different forms does it take?
So electromagnetic warfare is extensive. It's becoming increasingly well documented about the extent of jamming and things like GPS disruption, which make perhaps some technologies that Western militaries have known to rely on more difficult to implement. However, while it is certainly a threatening environment if a military wants to be able to rely on those capabilities at all times, what we are not seeing is a complete denial of the EMS. While Ukrainian drone crews, for example, are reporting that if they are using simpler commercial drones, and I know we will get onto that area in more detail in a little bit, but if the simpler, less resilient systems are being utilized, drone crews might lose a majority of their systems without being able to get them onto targets, or they may have sufficient disruption that they have to reverse course and scrub the mission, send their drone and bring their drones back in. But the reality is, defending against drones, it's pretty clear that drones will get through, even if there is good electronic defense up. Particularly, we are seeing windows of opportunity where if a force wants to either protect itself in a key window or to enable activity, they can use They can use jamming and interference quite effectively for several hours. But what they cannot do is they cannot jam even for an entire day. It's not possible. The Russians have been known to discuss this internally in some of their lessons learned, considering whether they should turn systems like Pol 21, one of their defensive systems that interferes with GPS, whether they should turn that on permanently. But it's not something they've actually been able to do because of the issues of power, the issues of overheating what are quite expensive and difficult to replace systems, and also the fact that they need the electromagnetic spectrum themselves to enable their own operations. So disruption, but not denial. That's what we're seeing.
Thank you, Nick. Let's go to the third trend. The third trend is, according to us, it's more and more difficult to hide on the battlefield. We see that the battlefield is more and more transparent at tactical level. And can you give us some examples of this transparency of the battlefield at tactical level, and how the two warring countries, the two belligerents, deal with this situation?
So, in terms of examples of transparency, even in the last year, I would say we've seen just the sheer density of UAS systems and the ability of, and I'm speaking at the tactical level, the brigade level and below, which is really certainly the level at which the Ukrainian military operates at. The density of systems means that a Ukrainian brigade will be able to detect units or systems perhaps out to 40 kilometers away some of the time. Within about 20 kilometers, they will generally know that something is there. By about 10 kilometers, any Russian unit, by example, that is in front of the Ukrainian lines, the Ukrainians, through electronic detection, through overhead observation with UAS, they will know not only that it's there, but they will know roughly where it is and be able to track it if it moves. That is not to say that they will be able to target it, but you know that awareness basically makes it very, very difficult to disguise intent. This has a huge impact on logistics. Actually, this is one of the areas where, while the mode of warfare is in many ways quite traditional, you see very big differences. So if we go back to World War II, for example, you had the ability of both sides to build up very large stockpiles of ammunition and logistics stocks, easily 20 miles behind the lines, much closer in many cases, and to have those, unless there was a concerted strategic bombing effort that could be delegated to hit certain logistics nodes, or they were unlucky with a penetration of the lines by one side or the other, it was very easy to build up stocks, and you see a very large volume of artillery fire being possible as a result. We saw this in 2022 as well. After the Russians withdrew from around Kiev and rationalized their front line, shortened it to a length that was manageable with the force that they had mobilized, the Russians really got the force that they wanted. They got to the conflict that they wanted. I think my colleague Jack Watling described it as two boxers going nose to nose in the Donbass, except one had lead shot in his gloves and was able to have that distinct advantage in firepower. They were able to build up very large stocks of ammunition, and it was Western aid, particularly the provision of intelligence support and HIMARS, that where we started to see the dynamic change, where suddenly the Russians found that they couldn't build up large ammunition depots, that they had to disperse much more. And since then, as Ukrainian domestic industry and international support kicked in, and the provision of more and more UAS and the ability to see further and more persistently, we've seen this sort of radical dispersion of across the Russian logistics networks in their rear and of ammunition supplies.
Thank you, Nick. Still about transparency of the battlefield, do you think it's still possible to deceive your adversary? And do you have examples of successful deception operation in Ukraine?
So in terms of, I'm going to use a little bit of British doctrine here, because I just think it sums up the areas in which you can create uncertainty for the enemy. We talk about C2, D2, camouflage, concealment, deception, and decoys. Now, in the past, we would rely very heavily on camouflage and concealment, whereas I think because of the fidelity of sensors, I mean, even very cheap electro-optical sensors on cheap drones, effectively the cameras, the footage available is good enough quality that if something is camouflaged, it will still be visible as what, and it'll be possible to tell what it is. A camouflage tank is still visible as a camouflage tank. It will not necessarily blend into the background. Now, those are still important because they prevent such easy detection at longer range, and they will still force an adversary or an enemy to look more closely at something, to assign assets, to have a look at it, to determine exactly what it is. So it still has value, but you cannot simply hide things. So the second part of that equation, D2, deception and decoys, are actually becoming more important. And we see extensive use of tactical decoys, for example. By even Soviet doctrine, this was supposed to take up to 30% of the effort of a military formation was to be put into making decoys. So this isn't necessarily new, but that's really been accentuated, and it's to to create false positives, to create uncertainty.
Thank you, Nick. So we see battlefield is more and more transparent at the tactical level, but not at the strategic level. And you used to say that it's still difficult to understand exactly what are the intentions of Mr. Putin. Now, I have no question about that. So let's go to the next trend, which is technological leveling. We see that some cutting-edge technologies, I would say, which can be used to develop very highly sophisticated weapons, are increasingly accessible to general public and therefore to our competitors, to our adversaries, and so we see how important are dual technologies, and this is especially the case regarding the drones in Ukraine, especially the mini and micro drones. And my question is, can you describe, I would say, the importance of those drones, the scale in which they are used, and also the large variety of use cases we see regarding those drones?
Yeah, of course. Actually, on surprise, though, I just did want to make a further point that I thought of. Actually, we have seen good examples of operational surprise. Perhaps one of the best examples was once again 2022, the ability of the Ukrainian military to launch a counteroffensive from Kharkiv. They reached Izium. They broke the First Guards tank army in battle by launching what was effectively a surprise attack. And the only reason the Ukrainians stopped at Izium was because they outran their own supply chains. Actually, the Russians fell back faster than they could advance. And if they had had more mass at that stage, they could have perhaps caused a systemic collapse within the Russian rear echelons and caused far greater problems. So a very unfortunate missed opportunity there. Actually operational secrecy seems to still be reasonably effective if that information can be assured and if forces can be moved quickly. There, once again, speaking logistics, the ability to move large formations through one's own rear and reposition them from front to front. The Ukrainians moved their forces by rail at night and did so very quickly. But actually very old-fashioned once again, but hugely important for being able to achieve those things if it can be done within a very short window of time. I think their repostering took less than 48 hours, if I remember correctly. Yes, technological leveling though. Speaking of dual-use technologies, yes, we've seen a lot of use of commercial technology in Ukraine, it's true. And I think particularly not just on the US space, but I would highlight the ability to use commercial satellite for imagery, that ability of smaller states to utilize what 10 years ago have been only open to sort of much more capable state actors. In particular, if you have multiple commercial providers with different satellite constellations, the latency of getting high-quality satellite images is very, very short. It's a matter of minutes, certainly less than an hour, if one has the access to the right providers, which has huge implications once again for the surprise and for the deception issues that we discussed. However, I would point to whole cost of capability and supply chains. Much has been made of at the unit level, the cost of $350 drones, which is usually slightly misleading anyway, because that's often the cost of the drone, not necessarily the cost of the drone and the munition that's attached to it, which would still only double the cost, so we're talking something less than $1,000. But if we take a Ukrainian UAV team, by example, that is about 5 people. It's a unit that will maneuver behind the Ukrainian lines to avoid detection. It will have a 4x4, maybe $30,000 US. You will have a driver. You'll probably have a couple of riflemen, infantry soldiers, to provide force protection, and also just that physical ability to provide basic lifting and shifting, manual labor. You'll have a drone engineer to ensure that the munitions are working and set up properly, and you will have a pilot, and perhaps 5 munitions for a day, if they're going to be conducting a day's operations before they return to whatever secure location they're operating from. So at a whole cost, particularly if we are talking a non-Ukrainian, non-mass mobilized society, with all the pay, the benefits requirements, pensions, and etc. For that is quite an expensive unit. And some Western drone systems, thinking loitering munitions, whether it's Switchblade or another system, although they are much more expensive at the unit, they're easier to use. They don't require the engineer on site. They can kind of be they can be launched quite easily, fired and forgotten in some cases. So yeah, the costs are, depending on the system, they could be comparable. However, on what the Ukrainians do benefit from with the cheap system they've adopted, because they're a mobilized society, it does make sense. It still allows them to leverage global supply chains for commercial equipment and get those munitions cheaply. And the mobilized personnel, relatively cheap as well. They are, Ukrainian society is at war, so the whole cost makes sense in that context. I would say as well, what's the best way of explaining it? Yeah, with the Ukrainians, when we look at the figures of how many, the lethality of different systems, we are seeing a disproportionate amount of damage done by cheap commercial UAS. And I think this has caused quite a few commentators to point at these systems and saying these clearly are the most effective. These should be the backbone of our force in future, and we need to disinvest in other capabilities. We've put this question to various Ukrainian officers at the brigade level who have been fighting on the front line, and they laugh at this. They say the reason we are using cheap UAS is because we can't get anything else. Artillery is the second biggest killer on the battlefield. It is still far outperformed by drones, but much of that is due to lack of munitions and particularly lack of working systems, particularly spare parts breaking, barrel burnout. So the Ukrainian brigades are having serious problems there. We spoke to one brigade where they were covering an 18 kilometers of frontage, and they only had 4 working howitzers. So absolutely, it was going to be drones that they were having to rely on for fires. Those systems, I should say, they don't fulfill exactly the same function. Even if they're providing indirect fire support, the latency on drones is quite long as well. The Ukrainians are finding that if they're operating sort of FPVs, for example, on a VHF frequency, if they have a couple of drones operating within 500 meters of each other, they will find the frequencies start to interfere with each other, particularly on the video stream. So calling in multiple drones on the same target at the same time can be quite difficult. Sorry, I don't want to get too technical on drones, but if you can put a seeker head on it and get it within range, then you can switch the method of terminal guidance, so you can achieve a higher density of systems in the same area, and they can clearly bring in drones in succession very quickly, one after the other. But still, drones are more picking off targets one by one. Over time, on a fixed front line, they will cause a devastating amount of attrition on adversary. But in terms of providing quick, reliable, high volume support, they still need barrel artillery. That, if they need to call for fires quickly because something has appeared, they need to break up an attack. They find they really need those systems to be on standby. They perform a different, much more capable close support role. So in the Kursk, the Ukrainians really suffered for this because they were optimized against Russian drone operations. They were conducting what I would say was extreme dispersion. We were seeing some of their forces. We would have perhaps 3 or 4 or 5 riflemen every 200 meters in heavily camouflaged defensive positions, effectively to provide that last line of defense against Russian attacks, which would usually be heavily attrited. In one instance, North Koreans launched a battalion-scale massed attack, probably not very sensible, very old-fashioned tactics. about 800 personnel advanced on their line, and they did take a pummeling. About the Ukrainians reported they killed about 300 of them before they reached their lines, but because they didn't have much artillery to call upon, and because of the thinness of that front line, the North Koreans were able to punch through. And actually, as much as what I've seen online has been not very complimentary about the North Koreans, actually the Ukrainians have reported they are very, very dangerous. And actually, and there, going back to the technology, some of the shortages of those more traditional systems, they did leave them quite vulnerable there. And in that particular incident, they were forced to bring in another battalion to basically counterattack and dislodge the North Koreans before they could achieve a breakthrough.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Let's go to the fifth trend. Sorry, just a technical issue. The last trend is a saturation of the battlefield and the importance of A2AD, that means anti-access and area denial capabilities. And what we see currently is a return of minefields, for example, huge minefields, so on both sides. And we see that most Western countries, except maybe the US, have banned the use of mines, so anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. And do you think our countries will have to reconsider this ban? Do you think in a high-intensity conflict it is possible to find something else, an alternative to mines, in order to contain the enemy?
Yes. So with specifically with mines, obviously a very, very traditional form of counter mobility. We're seeing its use extensively, and actually in many ways the Ukrainians and the Russians rely on it to the degree that they don't use other methods in the way that we would expect. So while they will use anti-tank ditches and dragon's teeth, for example, on the Russian side, we're seeing very little use to barbed wire or other systems. Actually, the technical question of counter mobility, my team have spent quite a bit of time thinking about this, discussing this. You know, given the sort of Ottawa Treaty and some of the issues around landmines, are there other systems that can fulfill this role? There are systems that, yes, can provide some defensive capabilities without using human personnel. So robotic systems, for example, can cover areas with fields of fire, and other obstacles such as barbed wire do provide some ability to slow down an enemy. However, ultimately, none of these systems are particularly effective. Mines are they're very cheap, they're very simple, they're very, very reliable, and other systems, they just don't saturate areas in the same way. The real value of mines is the imposition of dilemmas. So what we have seen, I think, throughout the war, once the front line settled, is the dilemma has classically been landmines force an attacking force to go slowly. They can't maneuver so easily, and if they encounter minefields and know that they're there, they will need to either avoid them, in which case they can be channeled into killing areas, or they will need to breach them. Whether that's with explosives, or unfortunately there are other methods, often by hand, and that just forces a force to reduce its tempo, to slow down. However, the extensive use of artillery on the battlefield, one of the best ways to avoid that is to move quickly and to maneuver. If you can't move quickly and maneuver, if you're forced to slow down, but slowing down and breaching minefields enables an enemy to bring fires down on you, this simply raises the level of attrition. We saw this heavily in the counter-offensive of 2023. Some of the issues the Ukrainians had in breaching minefields, and even with some of the mechanized warfare capabilities that they had. The ability of the Russians to lay such deep minefields, to go beyond the range of a Miklik, for example, a Miklik vehicle to cut through a minefield with a single breach. The Ukrainians were, incapable of making much headway. Now, I will say on that front that the Ukrainians standing up such a large force so quickly, there was definitely a deficit in training. This is something the Ukrainians recognized. There was also a big issue of them having sufficient engineering capability that was part of the way of countering that. You know, for example, one of the major complaints the Ukrainians had after the counteroffensive was that Western countries had demanded great success of them, were not sharing those risks, and yet even by Western doctrine, the Ukrainians had perhaps a quarter of the mine clearance vehicles that a Western military would have said that it required in order to make an operation successful. So very traditional combat engineering, offensive combat engineering, offensive breaching of obstacles. If it's covered with artillery, if it has the requisite air defense, it can cut through obstacles relatively quickly. So I certainly wouldn't say that maneuver is dead in that regard, but it's become much more difficult. And to launch an operation of that type, it needs to be much more of a deliberate operation. And once again, as we talked about the transparency on the battlefield, the fact that the logistics tail of that kind of kind of armored offensive would be visible from between 40 and 10 kilometers out. That's very, very difficult to do now. So, yeah, that's things have changed there.
Yeah. So there are so many questions we can ask again on these issues, but we're going to let's go to the 5 needs we consider for our armed forces. So the first need, we tend to forget it, but it's to have strong moral forces. War remains a clash of will and moral forces. It's I would say it has always been the case. And we see that Ukrainians and Russians on both sides have quite high moral forces to last in such a long war. And so the concept of moral forces aggregates some very important values such as courage, confidence of the soldiers in their mission, in the cause they serve, for example. And it's useless having, I would say, high performance equipment if you don't have courageous men and women to use it. And my question is, in your opinion, what are the main determinants and the main drivers of the moral forces of the two belligerents? What are the Ukrainians and or the Ukrainian and the Russian soldiers fighting for, indeed?
Okay, so on moral forces, I know we've spoken about propaganda, about leadership, and of setting an example, setting high expectations. And I think perhaps the other thing that I should flag is letting people know that there is hope, letting them know that there is a chance that they will win. Clearly, the Ukrainians have a very strong moral cause behind them. You know, also the fact that they have been attacked, unprovoked, and that they are fighting for their homeland. I mean, obviously, this will provide a great deal of motivation. However, I think a critical factor has been the maintaining that belief that the war is winnable, that actually a good outcome can come at the end of this, that Russia can be defeated or at least fought to a standstill. Now, unfortunately, this has had some downsides throughout the conflict. I would say that propaganda effort at the start of the war to demonstrate the will to fight was so important for Ukraine, and I think President Zelensky showed magnificent leadership in that critical time period. However, we then saw some serious issues when the Ukrainian military, and by the way, I apologize to any Ukrainians in the audience. I don't think there are any, but if there are, yes, we have one. There was probably a need to switch to a bit more attribution of some of the challenges Ukraine was facing. It was very, very difficult for Western countries to determine the exact dynamics on the battlefield. And yet some of the information about how the weaknesses of the Russian armed forces caused very optimistic appraisals of what would be possible for Ukraine. And this, unfortunately, played into some of the uncertainty about Western support, both a lack of understanding exactly where the critical Ukrainian needs were, and therefore what support should be prioritized, and also what the Russian strengths were. Now, I would say this was a dilemma that was imposed upon Ukraine because a lot of Western countries also kept on saying, well, Ukraine needs to prove in the next offensive that it can win in order to provide more support. I found this very strange when this was said before the counteroffensive, because from my point of view, the Ukrainians had broken the Russian army twice in battle in 2022. I divide that year into perhaps 7 campaign seasons, or 7 subordinate campaigns. The Russians won 3, I think they lost 4, and in 2 of them, around the Battle of Kiev and from Kharkiv to Izium, the Russian army broke and fled, or had to be withdrawn before it reached that point. What did Ukraine have to prove at that stage in terms of its will to fight? Absolutely nothing, and yet that question was asked again and again and again. So unfortunately, some of the need to push propaganda, it obfuscated some of the more accurate information, and coupled with the fact that Western countries were trying to support Ukraine by remote, I would actually say that is one of the critical lessons learned from this war. Actually, that it's very, very difficult to support a partner properly by remote without having personnel there alongside them to see the challenge they are facing, to identify all the smaller frictions, all the smaller problems that they are facing, particularly when you're providing systems, and to apply them. And now, with the war having dragged on, I think it must be very, very difficult for Ukrainian forces facing the situation they are and not knowing what, whether a positive outcome of regaining all of lost territory, for example, is possible. Now, the Russians are a much a much different organization. It's interesting that we've had a military where the morale has been consistently so low, where there has been a very, very poor rationale for a war that I think it's pretty clear that most Russian soldiers are not particularly invested in from their behavior, and yet a military has consistently fought and taken very high casualties and continue to do so. The Russian military has been very, very good at managing bad morale. We've seen many issues with Russian units. They often cooperate very poorly with units on their flanks. They often exhibit a very selfish behavior. But actually, for them to break in battle is relatively rare. They will usually stand, fight, and take casualties. Part of this is the way that the Russians rotate units. Once their mobilization kicked in by 2023, they were able to keep units in the line up until the point they had taken about 30% casualties, and then they would simply rotate them out before they became combat ineffective. And the fact they were operating at scale allowed them to do this. And so as much attrition was applied to them, they would continue to fight. Now, obviously, we've seen absolutely enormous casualty figures on the Russian side, and I think this has contributed to some of the quality problems of their ground forces. I should also say this is another very unusual factor in this war. I have never seen an example of a military fight for 3 years on a large-scale ground war and for its ground forces to remain at such a low quality. I would include the Soviet Union in World War II. In 1941, the Soviet army was in terrible shape. Despite the losses they took, they had to reconstitute themselves, I think it was 2.5 times over the course of the war, or more. I lose track of the figures. And yet, although they were ingesting a large number of personnel, took millions of casualties, their quality did improve. And by the end, they were a medium quality force. The Russian ground forces are still awful. And it's, there are a few factors in there I can point to. I think ultimately the Russian military does not value its personnel. They are a resource. What we would see as a problem, they seem to have absorbed and just thought of now as this is just normal. This is what the performance we should expect from a military. This is this coercive method of giving people minimal training and then forcing them into the front line this is how warfare works. It's very, very just a very, very different culture that you have under an authoritarian system, where all the innovation is focused on the technical side and on the fire side, and the ground force is neglected. I'm very, very thankful for that fact. But it's also a system that they're able to manage quite well. And when you couple that with pervasive propaganda, that saturation of the media ecosphere, we should also note that the Russians are continuing to man most of their units with contract soldiers, with volunteers, not with mobilizees who are, forced. I know there have been instances of a proportion of those forces being coerced. You had some conscripts effectively bullied into signing regular contracts. But people are still signing up. Another big factor of that is money. The Russians are offering very good wages now. In fact, the monthly wage for a Russian soldier is now slightly above the monthly wage of a British soldier. And when you consider purchasing power parity, what that means when they return home, this is a life-changing amount. it's true. There are instances of Russian soldiers being, a big rationale for signing up is also death benefits to help their family if they are killed. There are many instances of Russian soldiers not being paid those death benefits, of the state welching onto responsibility to them, but many others where people, yes, their families will simply receive the money. And this doesn't make people fight well, but within the Russian context, it's effective. I was going to say something else on that front. Anyway.
The way they compel guys to go to fighting on the Russian side.
Yes. No, I was going to make another point on it, but it's gone. So, basically, I would sum up, and the Russian system it's viable and it's dangerous. So it's certainly not a system to be underestimated in that regard.
Okay. Thanks, Nick. So the second need we see is a command and control capacity. What we call the C2 capability. So we need a C2 structure which is able to decide quickly and fairly based on relevant information. And so the scope is to run the famous UDI loop faster than our adversary. And can you describe, please, the overall organization of the Ukrainian C2, and especially the role played by, I would say, everyday digital tools? For example, to what extent does the Ukrainian C2 chain rely on personal smartphones, personal tablets, on commercial applications such as WhatsApp, Discord, Signal, and so on?
Absolutely. So first of all, I wouldn't want to overgeneralize, and this is much due to the segmentation of the Ukrainian military. Many brigades, because of their requirements to do much of their own procurement, the fact that they've had to set up many of these structures during the war without that ability to do it in a time of peace where capabilities can be rolled out, the reliance on volunteer organizations. The C2 structures in different brigades will look slightly different. So, yeah, I wouldn't generalize on that point. However, what we're seeing is, well, I think we often, in the West, certainly in the Anglosphere, when we think about what we want and we talk about different concepts for information and C2, for command and control and connectivity, I think we often overcomplicate it and we use military-specific language that does not really sum up what we want. What we want is just deployable internet. It's just deployable internet. It needs to be secure. It needs to be mobile. It needs to be robust. It probably needs to be able to link into satellite communications, particularly low orbit, such as Starlink, to provide resilience against jamming and to make it more difficult to detect. But the reality is it needs to be bearer agnostic, to use bearers of opportunity. By that I mean, if you need it to plug into military radios to fulfill certain roles, certain units will need military radios, but they will also need to be able to push data onto user-end devices that are, be they tablets or smartphones that are easy to use, that can do certain functions or provide video feeds. I've seen other things at different parts of the front line. The Russians, for example, they were using microwave communications on towers to provide up to 10 kilometers of communication that, if anyone's familiar with microwave comms, a narrow beam of it is quite hard to intercept unless you get something that can detect it in between the two towers. So in their rear areas, it would mean that those communications were difficult to intercept, and obviously a lot of use of the commercial internet, of just plugging into cell towers and pushing information. And yes, utilizing a lot of commercial apps, WhatsApp, Signal, Discord, Google Meets, things that are simple, easy to utilize. I've seen things like brigade commanders sketching out plans of attack on a bit of paper, photograph it on his phone, push it over Google Meets to his company commanders and launch an attack that way during the counteroffensive. Very simple, but it works. We shouldn't overcomplicate things. Obviously, the weaknesses of the Ukrainian approach, weaknesses due to the necessity of making do, are that it probably isn't particularly secure. The ability of the Russian military to detect a lot of that communication and over time understand the intent is a bit problematic. Even if they're using encryption, commercial grade encryption, 256-bit encryption, for example, the Russians will be able to crack that within a reasonable time frame. But what we haven't seen is, this hasn't been disastrous for the Ukrainians either. It simply meant that they have to accept that a certain amount of information, quite a bit of it will leak out, but it's perfectly adequate for using military operations. So, my suggestion there is actually what we, Western militaries, the UK, could adopt a perfectly workable, secure-ish military system that would provide a basis for its needs quite quickly if they turned around to some of the major tech primes that build this kind of technology and just pulled the trigger on implementing a new system. The UK, for example, has tied itself in knots over years, trying to over-specify, what its digital backbone should be, and has, ultimately not gone firm on one solution and has been left with some very, very old equipment. There is scope for a 1.0 solution there. So I think the future, what the future will look like is already out there. It's multi-bearer. It will have different kind of networks at different places, depending what's needed. But a lot of it is, very, based on commercial systems or commercial bearers.
Thank you, Nick. The third lead we see is mass. That means the number, the volume of force. Mass we see that it is essential in a high-intensity conflict to impose a positive balance of power, to saturate the enemy. Our problem in Europe, at least in Europe, is that we have lost the mass. We have lost the mass because of shrinking budgets, but we have lost the mass mainly because of increasingly expensive capabilities that makes that we have a limited number of capabilities. So, could you please explain us how the Russians and the Ukrainians succeed in getting the mass on this war?
So I'm conscious that we have, I've been going for 51 minutes and I would like to get to the Q&A, so I'll try and keep my answer for the next 3 points as brief as possible, because I'd like to give you that opportunity to question me. On mass, I mean, obviously at this stage in the war, it's clear that the scale at which war will occur is, Western militaries are simply not operating with the relevant level of mass that they are likely to have to if they end up in a conflict in future. We certainly in the UK have shrunk our force catastrophically. Now, I think the Ukrainian approach has been very much just out of necessity. Unfortunately, we've seen some unfortunate situations that have really, really hampered the Ukrainian ability to fight in the way that they perhaps would have liked to if they'd had the chance to prepare better before the war. The Ukrainian military was, under a lot of pressure to modernize, and there were a lot of structural reforms, particularly from 2017 onwards. But in terms of its equipment, it was very much having to make do, and this is why we've seen that high-low mix in the way that they have done it. If a military has a chance to prepare before a war to modernize, then I think there would have been, that would have looked quite different. What is critical is that industry needs to be a big part of the ability to fight a prolonged conflict, in particular munitions depth. Ukraine had probably the largest stockpile of conventional artillery shells, by example, in Europe, outside of Russia, and it burned through it very quickly. This was also, by the way, a stockpile that the Russians had deliberately targeted after 2014, attempted to destroy, and in many cases successfully destroyed as much of it as possible. And we also had the destruction of, by example, the major ammunition dump in Czechia. I forget which year it was. In any case, it was one of the most notable incidents after 2014, which in retrospect turned out not to have been an accident. It was deliberate sabotage to write down ammunition stocks. Reality was that I think Ukraine once again came very, very close to running out before Western support kicked in. Just having a depth of munitions supply is absolutely critical, and likewise having the capacity to manufacture large volumes munitions. Likewise, barrels and artillery systems, very, very important. One of the weaknesses that I know there is some concern about is that when we're looking at commercial systems such as UAS to fill some of those gaps, is the reliance on East Asian supply chains, particularly China. While the ability to assemble, the ability to write software in Ukraine is very, very good, the reality is, the components are still having to come from abroad, and particularly from China. And if China started imposing more stringent export controls, it wouldn't cut off that supply because of the international market and because those systems and those components are widely sold, but it would constrain supply at a time when the Ukrainian military is already being squeezed. So in many ways, the lessons are industrial. They're not particularly complicated, but there needs to be an ability to onshore, and there needs to be ability to stand up capacity at scale. Basically, there needs to be a strong foundation in order for a nation to fight. The only other thing I would note on that is, as European countries are reorienting their defence industries to try and revitalize NATO's conventional forces, we have the serious risk of different countries competing with each other for the same raw materials or components. So while different countries have pledged to increase spending, if they end up drawing on the same limited pool of resources when we're talking about particularly explosive energetics that will be used in filling munitions, quite simply that increased of funding into defence industry will not necessarily translate into increased supply. Instead, it will just result in difficulties. So those kind of multilateral agreements and coordination are really important there as well.
Thank you, Nick. The fourth need is strategic depth, which is vital in a long attritional war. So Russia has a strategic depth of a continent, at the scale of a continent. And you mentioned it, it has also kept considerable stockpiles from the Soviet time. Do you know how much currently of the Russian equipment delivered to the forces on the battlefield comes from those stocks? And when do you think those stocks could be depleted, and for what kind of equipment?
Yes, so I think we've covered munitions to some degree, but I would say that early on in the war, we were looking at predictions for how long the Russians could maintain the war just from their stockpiles. We actually did overestimate this because actually storage conditions, in particular, for some of the munitions were very poor. So the numbers that were coming out about, the Russians having 6 million shells that they could utilize, a lot of those proved not to be usable. So the Russians have already burned through most of the supplies of many of things of that class and are relying much more on new manufacture. But I think what we haven't touched on is armored vehicles. Russia has had significant Cold War stocks of vehicles. In fact, as an aside, it's also possibly a contributing factor to how the Soviet Union bankrupted itself by overspending on arms. But that did provide Russia a huge amount of vehicles that it could refurbish and enable it to ultimately utilize them in quite a wasteful manner. We did some predictions last year, and it looks like at some stage in the latter half of this year, the Russian boneyards of older vehicles, armored vehicles, be they from BTR up to T-72, T-80, will run out, and they will be reliant on new manufacture. At which stage, their ability to make new vehicles is pretty slow. Their defense industry is quite sluggish. And part of the reason they've been able to turn out such large numbers is because they are refurbishing rather than making new. However, up until that point, the Russian military will still remain dangerous. And also, it's quite difficult to predict, the numbers of vehicles that they're recovering. We're not talking about just refurbishment of stocks, but actually a major part of how an armored force can sustain itself is by recovering systems that have been knocked out, mission killed on the battlefield, and sending them back to be repaired. And we really don't have a clear picture of how successful the Russians have been there. Obviously, we have quite a lot of evidence. There are different outlets. Oryx for a long part of the war was the predominant one, but there are others looking at how many vehicles have been knocked out. But the reality is what we don't have a clear picture of is where the Russians have been able to basically recover some of those. So I certainly wouldn't want to make an exact prediction on that front. What I will say is they will run into serious difficulties further down the line if they continue to fight in the way that they're doing.
Thank you, Nick. Final need, the fifth one. So we see that capacity for innovation and adaptation is also a key factor to win in a long war. In the war in Ukraine, we see that the adaptation loop between the sword and the shield is very, very quick, very, very fast. And we used to think that Ukrainians are much more agile, much more inventive than the Russians. Do you think it's true? And according to you, in which areas the Russians have demonstrated that they are also able to be inventive and agile?
So yes, I think it's the Ukrainians have proven much more agile than the Russians. I think particularly at the brigade level and below, the brigades that are committed to the fight, that are working with volunteer organisations, much of it out of necessity, but their ability to bring in younger people, to put them to work closely with volunteer organisations, to come up with new ways of fighting based on severe resource limitation. Yes, the Ukrainians have been remarkably adaptable. However, with the Ukrainian system, I would also flag that, unfortunately, the Ministry of Defence does seem to be quite sluggish. There's no real way around that. Part of the, I definitely, and I won't name any names here, but I definitely heard some frustrations on the part of, younger Ukrainians trying to innovate, trying to change things, and pushing back against a system that is still, in some ways, very, very Soviet in its bureaucracy. Requirement for written orders, requires for multiple layers of process and sign-off. So we've seen it in some areas, not in all. What I would also say is there has been, I think cultural change has been a pretty critical one. And this is not just newer, younger Ukrainians who've grown up in a more liberal culture during the military. It's actually something very self-consciously the military has done, is the need to treat people like humans and to treat them better. Actually, to be honest, I think this is one of the major changes that has happened, and probably one of the reasons for Ukrainian success. It is just treating its people like citizens, like humans. When I visited 95th Air Assault Brigade, for example, and saw how its soldiers were treated, making sure that they were kept warm, that they were sort of billeted properly, that they were made sure they were fed. The brigade commander, Colonel Bratishko, he was making sure he was doing the rounds, visiting his platoons, visiting his platoon commanders, ensuring that the soldiers were being, looked after, that, in their discipline they were taking care of themselves. While that military system looked very different from a Western one in some regards, the ability for younger soldiers to converse with their Ukrainian superiors was not something you would have seen in the Soviet military or the Ukrainian military, for that matter, as I understand, prior to 2014. And that was something that I know the Ukrainian MOD has leaned quite heavily into. I don't think that's been an even process. The reports are that other units treat their personnel in not quite the same way, and much of that is dependent on personality of older, perhaps older commanders or more traditionally minded commanders, but absolutely critical area there that's enabled all the other change has been, that core area of culture. The Russians, in terms of innovation and adaptation, they have been much more sluggish in some regards, and certainly their ability to come up with new ideas, to come up with new technological innovations has been more limited. But they are very good at copying what they see working on the battlefield. Most of their concepts about how they utilize ISTAR and drones have been, they're not purely Russian. Much of them have been borrowed or adapted from Western concepts that they saw in, from Western operations, and the success of how, the West has used certain bits of technology. They've also taken a lot of what they've seen Ukrainian armed forces doing and copied them very quickly. And I think the centralization of the Russian armed forces, the fact that they have rear areas that are much safer, the fact that they do not have the same strategic air campaign targeting them, there is just very limited strikes within Russia. They have that ability to spread lessons learned much more quickly. They don't have the same segmentation where brigades are having to do a lot of their innovation. And while it does mean that if there are technical innovations that suddenly make the Russians very vulnerable, particularly to new types of fires and new ways of penetrating their airspace, the combined arms armies are very good at gathering lessons learned, writing up, determining technical solutions, and then spreading them very quickly. So we've seen definitely kind of periods of the Russians being effective, becoming less effective, becoming very vulnerable, and then suddenly a whole host of solutions to different methods of targeting them, of hitting them, of striking them in depth, of those windows of opportunity just closing as they've adjusted their air defenses, they've adjusted their electronic warfare. So the Russians do have some strengths to their system. Once again, I wouldn't underestimate them.